The required SCOTUS case we chose was McCulloch versus Maryland from 1819.
Here's some background information on this case. The U.S. was still a relatively new nation at the time. After a first attempt in 1791, Congress established the first national bank of the United States in 1816. This created a lot of tension between the states and the government because the states did not want the national bank competing with their own banks. In 1818, the state of Maryland passed legislation to impose a tax of $15,000 on the bank. This is when James W. McCulloch, who was a cashier of the Baltimore branch of the bank, decided to refuse to pay the tax. The state appeals court held that the second bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not provide a textual commitment for the federal government to charter a bank. Maryland argued that, as a sovereign state, it had the power to tax any business within its borders. But on the other hand, McCulloch's attorneys argued that a national bank was necessary and proper for Congress to establish in order to carry out its enumerated powers.
The constitutional questions which arose were, first, did Congress have the authority to establish the bank under the Constitution? So this power is not explicitly given to them in the Constitution, so are they able to commit this act? Are they able to create a national bank? The second question is, did the Maryland law unconstitutionally interfere with congressional powers? Are they allowed to interfere with federal affairs and overstep their boundary and essentially tax the government and this national bank? Some applicable law is the 10th Amendment. This was used by Maryland to strengthen their case. So the 10th Amendment gives powers to states that are not explicitly given to the government by the Constitution and are also not prohibited to the states. So Maryland claimed that because of the 10th Amendment, they were allowed to tax any business in their borders, which included the national bank.
So that brings us to the two possible outcomes that the court could have. The first option is that Congress decides that the government does not have the authority to establish a national bank because it's not explicitly said in the Constitution, and that Maryland did not interfere with congressional powers because it has the right to tax businesses in the state. The other option is that Congress can establish a bank and that Maryland did interfere with congressional powers.
So the Supreme Court's decision was unanimous. They said that Congress did have the right to establish a national bank, although the power is not explicitly stated in the Constitution. Secondly, they said that, yes, Maryland law did unconstitutionally interfere with congressional powers, and they did overstep their boundaries.
So the reasoning behind this decision was that Congress has the explicit power to tax and regulate currency. This is because of the necessary and proper clause, which gives Congress the power to make all laws that should be necessary and proper for carrying into execution. This showed that the Constitution did not limit Congress to doing only the things specifically listed in Article 1. So when Congress needed a way to tax and regulate the currency, it made it completely constitutional to open up a national bank. In addition, Maryland's attempt to tax the national bank violated federal supremacy, and that made it therefore unconstitutional. So overall, federal law was supreme to state law. So even though the states have the power to tax, the federal laws reign supreme. So here are some quotes from Chief Justice John Marshall that explain his reasoning. The first quote basically says that it is constitutional to have a national bank that collects taxes and borrows money. The second quote explains that the states may tax within the state, but they do not have the right to tax the federal government.
So this ruling had a major impact on the definition of federalism in the United States and what exactly federalism is. It greatly increased the federal power by reaffirming that federal law is greater than state law. It has more authority, it's more supreme, so states cannot simply overturn national law and choose to ignore it. It also reaffirmed that the United States has a very strong central national government.
Similar cases to McCulloch versus Maryland that are important to understand the connection between them. So one is Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. And what's important to think about here is that both cases voted in favor of the federal government's control over state affairs. So to begin, New York state laws gave Robert R. Livingston and Robert Fulton a monopoly over navigation on waters within state jurisdiction. Aaron Ogden and other competitors tried to forestall the monopoly, but Livingston and Fulton largely succeeded in selling, franchise, or buying competitors' boats. Then there was Thomas Gibbons, a steamboat owner who did business between New York and New Jersey under a federal coastal license, and he formed a partnership with Ogden, which soon fell apart after 3 years when Gibbons operated another steamboat on the New York route belonging to Ogden. Ogden filed a suit against Gibbons in the New York court, and he received a permanent injunction. The New York State Court rejected Gibbons' arguments, asserting that the U.S. Congress controlled interstate commerce. So the question here was, does the Commerce Clause give Congress authority over interstate navigation? The conclusion was that the Constitution's Supremacy Clause stated that New York monopoly was void because it conflicted with federal law. Another similar case to look at is Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the 1800 presidential election. Adams then passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which allowed him to appoint new judges. He used this as an attempt to frustrate Jefferson. William Marbury was one of the people that was appointed, but his commission was not delivered. Marbury petitioned that the Supreme Court needed to compel the new Secretary of State, James Madison, to deliver the documents. The questions for this case are, can Marbury sue for the commissions in court, and does the Supreme Court have the authority to order the delivery of their commissions? It concluded that, though Marbury was entitled to it, the court was unable to grant Marbury his access to the job. And overall, this helped to prove that the federal laws are over the state laws, and the federal government expanded its power over this.
So a fun way you can remember this case is to remember that McCulloch represents the national bank, or the federal law in this case. And obviously Maryland represents the state and the state powers. So if you take the Cull out of McCulloch, you can think of the Cullens from Twilight, which are the vampire family, and the vampires are the most powerful in the movie. And therefore, the federal law is more powerful than the state law. It reigns supreme. So that's one way you can think of it. And then there's also a meme there with Drake to remember it. These are our works cited, and that concludes our presentation. Thank you.